Hi, everyone, and welcome to Better Infill's third webinar. My name is Kevin Taft. While you're settling into your seats and getting a drink of water or whatever, let's cover some important business before we meet our guests. The Coalition for Better Infill is a network of citizens from across Edmonton who are deeply concerned about infill in mature residential neighborhoods. Our supporters include planners, architects, and engineers, environmentalists and builders, community organizers, entrepreneurs, seniors, and young households, and get fanned out from there. We're an independent voice for people who live in Edmonton's mature neighborhoods. We call ourselves Better Infill for a reason. We understand infill is important and valuable and believe the way it's being handled in Edmonton right now could be so much better. The current City Council has largely deregulated the infill industry. Public input and even basic notifications have been eliminated. The city issues building permits the same day they're submitted. Lot coverage and height allowance have been increased. There's no tree protection, and requirements to fit with neighborhood contexts have been eliminated. Tonight, we welcome viewers not just from Edmonton, but also from Calgary, Saskatchewan, BC, and Ontario. Infill is a national issue, and Edmonton is increasingly presented by some interests as a leading example, but perhaps it should be a cautionary tale. Let's see what our guests say. You can learn more about Better Infill at our website, www.betterinfill.ca. If you value today's program, please consider a contribution to the GoFundMe page on the homepage, or the GoFundMe button. It's on the left hand, about halfway down, there's a little donate button. We're all volunteers. These events cost money to put on, so any support at all would be really appreciated. Today's session is being hosted in Edmonton, which is located within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. We acknowledge this land as the traditional territory of many First Nations, such as Cree, Dene, Stoney, Soltu, and Blackfoot. Edmonton owes its strength and vibrancy to these lands and the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors occupied this territory, as well as settlers from around the world who call Edmonton home. We call upon all our traditions and spirits to work together to build a great future. Our theme tonight is infill. Is there a better way? We'll be taking questions and comments. If you have questions, go to the question icon, which is probably towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll take time to put some of the questions to our guests. We have two amazing guests. It's just such a privilege to have these two fellows with us, and they bring Canadian experience. In fact, our first guest, Dr. Barry Johns, has practiced architecture in Edmonton for most of his career. Barry is an award-winning and widely published architect in Edmonton. He's a former Chancellor of the College of Fellows of Royal Architectural Institute of Canada from 2011 to 2017, and Director of Practice for the Alberta Association of Architects from 2015 to 2019. His career of more than 40 years includes an extensive tenure with Arthur Erickson in Vancouver and spans private practice, teaching, and public service. He is the first international recipient of the Leslie M. Boney Medal from the American Institute of Architects, where he is an honorary fellow for outstanding service to the profession. He received the Doctor of Design degree from the University of Calgary in 2023 for his pioneering work in developing backfill, which is an acronym, BAAKFIL. It's a new approach to addressing the housing crisis in Canada. The research is published by Routledge out of New York. This is my copy of the book. It's just published last year. You can see I've got lots of little stickies in it, many powerful comments in here. And what's wonderful about it for Canadians is it's chock-a-block with Canadian and especially Edmonton examples. Very, very great stuff. Our second guest is going to be familiar to those of you who participated in our September webinar, Larry Beasley. Larry is a senior Canadian urbanist, a city planner, urban designer, teacher, and author. He's the founding principal of Beasley and Associates, an international consultancy. For many years, he was the chief planner of the city of Practice Professor of Planning at the University of British Columbia. Working in cities around the world, he's completed game-changing assignments in Abu Dhabi, Moscow, Dallas, Scandinavia, Australia, and across Canada. He's authored 2 popular books, Vancouverism, which I read last summer, get brownie points for that maybe, and Eco-Design for Cities and Suburbs. His online course has had a worldwide reach. His 3rd book, Planning Abu Dhabi, will be out within the next year. He's a member of the Order of Canada. Barry and Larry, welcome to our webinar, what I hope will be a
Thanks, Kevin.
Great evening. So as I mentioned, our theme this evening is infill. Is there a better way? And it is very timely. So about 13 months ago, Edmonton City Council largely deregulated infill, and the results have been dramatic. More apartments are being built in Edmonton than in Toronto, a city 4 times the size. Edmonton hit 97% of its 3-year target for housing starts in its first year, which gives a sense of how much they relaxed the system. And the Canadian Real Estate Association reports housing prices in Edmonton jumped to their highest levels ever. While these sound to some people like wonderful things, for many people, they are troubling outcomes. They're indicating a system that's simply running wild. And not surprisingly, debates about infill have exploded in Edmonton. Infill's mailbox is any indicator the public is feeling overwhelmed that their neighborhoods have been turned into what one person called off-leash zones for infill developers. But lost in all this debate is a basic question. This is where we're going to begin. You don't find this in city documents or plans, but it seems fundamental. The question is this: what is good infill and what is bad infill? Barry, you just published a book that explores that exactly. So we'll start with you. What is good infill and what's bad infill?
Thanks, Kevin. And it's let me tell you, it's great to be sharing the podium, the virtual podium with Larry. We've been colleagues for a long time, and this is a treat. So I'm going to try and set the context for us by going back to the beginning, where good infill initiated in Edmonton around 2008, 2009, around the premise that modest projects would respectfully fill in the gaps in mature neighborhoods. The gaps being open spaces, open lots, underutilized areas, or even derelict houses that were due to be replaced. And the premise behind all of that was to enable neighborhoods to do their part in reducing sprawl and its increasing infrastructure requirements and cost. So in my mind, respectful design and densification at scale that fits into its location, which is a really simple term, is good. I think we have to remember that infill in Edmonton and in most major cities in North America target mature neighborhoods. They're not new subdivisions. They already have a long history. They have a context. They have people that live there and love their neighborhood, and actually, in many, many cases, if not the majority, want to age in their community. And I think that needs to be celebrated. And the other point that needs to be stated, and I'll be quick about this, is that the majority of people who live in mature neighborhoods in Edmonton are those of modest income. And so people who have spent decades paying off their properties, and now that they're paid off, they don't want to be pushed out and all of a sudden find themselves being displaced. So I think what happens when we come to the definition of bad infill, it's really simple to describe. It's areas where increased building speculation has occurred and where good housing, serviceable housing, has been demolished unnecessarily. So big, disrespectful, and expensive developments are now very rapidly atomizing our neighborhoods, thanks now to zoning reform, which every city in North America needs to address the housing crisis. But infill was never designed and was never conceived to address a housing crisis. It was meant to deal with something quite different. And it worries me that the process of building overscaled projects that are squeezed onto skinny lots with no regard for community value sets are bad, because they're conflating the idea of building neighborhoods and adding needed density in favor of trying to solve the housing crisis.
Wow. Okay. You packed a lot into that, Larry. I don't, did you want, am I interrupting you?
No, I'm
No.
just looking at the time and I'm trying to be
Oh,
brief,
we
which is
got,
hard for
we
an
got,
architect to do.
got tons of time. So Larry, why don't you start by giving us your answer to those questions? What is good infill? What's bad infill?
Well, I think Barry's given us a good start. Good infill to me is when you take advantage of opportunities that will always be in the urban system for adding some housing in. You want housing that gives diversity. You want housing that gives different economic ranges. But you do want housing that adds some intensity, is able to use existing infrastructure, parks, community facilities that have already been invested and paid for. And when we know that in many of our communities, the size of the household has gone down from 3 or 4 to 1 or 2, there
That's right.
is some capacity in those amenity systems to bring in some new people. That's good infill, and it is very good to help to bring in new people into your community without a huge investment in infrastructure. Bad infill is when you're doing all that and it doesn't fit. Very simply, it just doesn't fit. And how do you decide it fits or doesn't fit? Is that made by a city councilor or a planner? I think first and foremost, it's made by the community itself. So the community has to say what fits. And in order to find that out from the community, you have to have wide and continuous public engagement. You have to help people understand what the issues are. You have to help them understand how to express what they need, their worries, but also their potentialities. And I have to tell you, I've done this for 50 years. If you get into a serious conversation, a respectable conversation, you don't get NIMBYism and all that people talk about all the time. You get reasonable people trying to figure out good answers, but they want a conversation where their concerns are also given some weight, as well as the objectives of the public and the government and all that. And when they do that, two aspects really come out. One is, where do you want to have it? The one thing I think is very bad infill, and I'll come to some reasons why later, is when it's just random, it's anywhere. Because what that does, first and foremost, it means all land is subject to speculator attack, which means all land values go up, which means it's harder for any development to do any development because they can't afford it. And the second thing is how. And there's one little concept that just can serve you like crazy, and that's just called neighborliness. There is a lot to be talked about in terms of how close that is to you, whether or not you have some views, whether or not there's privacy, whether or not you get no sun anymore, all of those reasons. And not to mention, you did mention it already, whether or not there's room for landscape and the things that you need in a community. So bad infill doesn't achieve any of that. It just crams more housing in and then everyone celebrates the numbers. But in the long run, your cities reputation, identity, image, and livability goes down. And when that
That's right.
happens, that's not a resilient situation, in my opinion. So you have to have local government, the council, but even more so the staff, the community, people who are interested, and you have to go out and really get them because, they're not just going to come to you by accident.
Right.
And experts when you can bring them in, all working together to try to find out how you find that fit on where and how.
Can
Wow.
I just
Yeah,
jump in
please,
to add to what Larry was saying? We're supposed to
please.
rip off
That's,
each
yeah,
other,
let's
so
just bounce around here for sure.
yeah, we're talking about good infill and bad infill, and so far, not the word architecture has not been used once. We're talking at 35,000 feet about the rules of engagement that enable architecture to be fluid and positive. We're talking about setting the rules of engagement about city making within which good architecture can follow. We can never legislate it, good architecture. It seems, always find bad architecture. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the principle of community involvement and community value sets, and that those must underpin the nature of how development occurs, and it's not happening here.
And I'll just want to add to that. The application of good architectural principles is how the layman works with the expert to find the neighborliness. An architect is not going to just do anything unless there's no one's talking to them. But an architect, she or he, will listen to the users, the neighbors, the community, and find solutions that really work. So I think there has to be guidelines. There has to be some way of evaluating. Most importantly, going out of the gate, in my opinion, is that you have to have a regulatory system that confers rights at the right time to the right people, and then make sure that there is certain quid pro quo for those rights to
Okay,
make the community work.
so I'm going to struggle to try to keep this balanced because I have some views here. But when you, for example, Larry, you said bad infill is random infill.
Yeah.
Anything can happen anywhere. Well, that's exactly what the city of Edmonton has done. They've opened up the great majority of the city to the same kind of infill, no matter what neighborhood you're in. Anything can happen, mid-block, corner lots, busy streets, quiet streets. It is really random. And
And so
so
what,
yeah, go ahead. So,
well, I was going to say, Kevin, what does that lead to first and foremost? It leads to every single person in a neighborhood, the people who just look at their land from the point of view of their value, thinking, oh, I get more value for my land now. And it leads to every single speculator, and speculators are out there in the real estate community saying, this is like going fishing in a large sea.
yeah.
And as
Well,
soon as I find the opportunity, and so up go the values, it always happens when it's random.
okay, well, and that's exactly what we're seeing in Edmonton. I think we'll come to the issue of affordability in a minute here. Barry, you said, and I'm struck with this in Edmonton. Uh, People love their neighborhoods. People put down deep roots. They really care. Not everyone, but an awful lot of people really love their neighborhoods. Um, and that can bring in a situation where people resist change. People just want it to be just the way it is. So if we're looking
I,
for better infill without being random, without just throwing the whole thing open, how
yeah.
do we proceed? How do we move
Well,
from bad
first of
to
all,
good?
I'm not sure I agree with that premise.
Okay.
Most people who live in their neighborhoods for 25 to 30 years or longer are renovating their houses, are upgrading their garages, are changing their landscaping, are reacting to the actual family demographic that is the daily exercise of life, right? So the kids move out, the kids move back in, the grandparents come closer together. All these things are part of the act of living. So change is not something that people are afraid of. What in my mind precipitates fear is a lack of trust that the granular level of community care is ignored by those that are making all of the regulations that enable development outside of one's control to occur right next door. That's where people are against change. But I don't believe for a minute that people are against change as a
Okay.
philosophical position.
All right.
No, I want to add to that too. The fact is, every single time in my whole life of professional life, I've gone into a community and had a real conversation, asking questions like, where are your children going to live when they want to form their own household? Are they going to have to go somewhere way out in the suburbs? Or where are you going to live when you'd like to kind of, scale down and take advantage of the asset that you've built up over the years? People will start thinking about it in the same way they think about renovation and all that. It's called renovating the neighborhood to meet all of our current needs. And almost everyone, when it comes down to it, can understand that we have to have diversity in our neighborhoods so that different generations can live together. Not to mention, when you start have different ethnic communities that come in who are multi-generational, people understand all those things. But if you don't have a conversation, a person will go on defense. And defense is NIMBYism. It's not a conversation. It's I'm drawing a line because I have to fight a war.
So you're essentially, both of you are saying, and this would resonate with my experience in politics, is if you genuinely engage with people and listen to them, give them some input, then their barriers come down. And if you don't engage with them, and if you surprise them, and if you're random, they become frightened and angry, and the barriers go up. Yeah.
It sounds like a naive trope, but it's true. It's
Yeah.
100% true.
Yeah.
I mean, we've done community consultations for years on public projects, and the sidebars are where you learn things. The presentations to a large audience are not where you learn very much. That's for people who need to be vocal or vocal. It's the meeting that happens after the meeting that generally
Right.
becomes more valuable to us as designers and planners, and if you like, thinkers, so that you get to the heart and soul of where people are really finding their own values, and they're out there, and people have an awful lot more in common than I think we give neighborhoods credit for, to be honest.
So, so we're I'm going to move us on here in a moment, but just what's happened in Edmonton under this current regime is essentially the opposite of that. So people aren't even notified what's being built next door. And I'll give you an example I learned of over the weekend, a block or so from my place. The neighbors, there was a construction site. They thought it was a duplex. They had the understanding that it was a duplex. It's on a maybe at most, if I don't think it's maybe a 44-foot wide lot, maybe it's 50 feet. But they'd had no notice. Nobody had spoken to them. It turned out it's an 8-plex with 18 occupants. It's an 18-bed. It's not a rooming house, but a housing facility with a total of 8 different units, and they were just shocked. It was just, and so people like that end up in arms because they're surprised. And
absolutely. And there's lots of room for that in our city, in any city. But I go back to the comment that if it's not a good fit in the context of a block in a neighborhood, then it's bad.
Yeah.
Right. And you're never going to win any battle where you are going to try and convince them that it's anything other than bad, because people are so deeply connected to the love of their neighborhood, and that has to be respected.
That's right. We have to tap into the love people have of their neighborhoods, not the danger they feel they're in from exterior forces.
Wow. Okay.
You have to
We're gonna have a
put
love
in
in here.
yeah, well, no, we do.
No, no,
Because when
I
you
think that's great.
really, yeah, when you
I,
tap into that,
yeah,
people will find all kind of
yeah,
solutions. They don't want their kids to have to live in the far suburbs.
yeah. No, that's great. Okay, well, let's move on just a little bit. One of the common justifications, I've had an ongoing discussion with with my city councilor on this, and I know it gets trotted out a lot, is that infill and increasing densification, building more houses like this will improve affordability. In other words, it'll lower housing costs, but it doesn't seem to work that way. And in Edmonton in the last year, we've seen Edmonton still a relatively affordable city, but we've seen the highest ever jumps. Larry, you actually referred to this a little bit when you said when you rezone a whole city, everywhere becomes open to speculation.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between infill and land values and housing affordability?
Well, let's look at all development. Wherever you say going from raw land to old industrial, obsolete industrial land, brownfields as we call them, wherever you say you can do more, the marketplace just does a calculation. And it says, well, this land's worth more. And in a settled neighborhood setting, oftentimes people just think they deserve more. My grandmother was a speculator by accident. She bought her house for 12 grand. She wanted, 1.5 million when she learned that a 5-story building could be built in that neighborhood. Well, what that does, and if there are no regulations and no process or anything, that means a developer is disarmed when he or she goes to that landowner and says, I can't build for that value. And they'll say, well, why not? I mean, it says you can do that. They have no sense of the economics, the pro forma of the development. So ironically, and it was actually it was a developer that helped me understand this. Ironically, when you open up land widely and it increases value generally, you're making it harder for developments to really happen.
Hmm.
You'll get speculation, you'll get someone who'll try something, and you tend to get higher prices because they've had to pay more for the land. So if you're going to do that, you have to add some regulations to help. Let's secure affordability. Let's secure rental as a part of the equation. You'll have to start doing that. You have to be clever with the regulatory regime to allow the development to occur, manage how it occurs, and
Okay.
manage to keep the speculator at bay.
Okay, so Barry, you've given this a lot of thought. So just put it to you directly. Are infill and densification likely to bring down land values and housing prices or cause them to rise?
It's a very simple arithmetic exercise, and the answer is land costs will always go up. Infill will not bring anything down. In fact, infill increases land value in mature neighborhoods and it undermines affordability. It does the opposite to what we're being told to believe. Number one, people need to understand that land value is not real. Land value is artificial. It's made up. It's worth what the market will bear. That's how the system works. So to give you an example, land values in mature neighborhoods will always increase, especially now with infill, which is the densification agenda. So the average cost of a house in all of the city now, as of last month, is $540,000. So in most of the 84 mature neighborhoods of Edmonton, you can find good bones and in these older neighborhoods, property, single family lots for somewhere between, we'll say, $325,000 to $450,000. But if you tear that house down and subdivide that property, you can sell that skinny lot, two of those lots, for the same price as the original cost of the single family property. So you're looking at $400,000 plus just for a piece of land. So to argue that infill by definition has the ability to increase affordability is crazy. Unless there's a way, this is my segue, unless there's a way to remove land costs from the equation. Land cost is the biggest barrier by far. It's unassailable to the housing affordability crisis we have in this country.
Right. I was surprised. I read a book by somebody, I know you know Larry quite well, Patrick Condon. Maybe you know him, Barry, from
I know him
do.
very
UBC,
well. Yep.
Broken Cities. And he went through a bunch of data showing that over the decades, the actual costs of construction, once you account for inflation and so on, have not really risen all that
That's right.
exorbitantly. What's driven the surge in housing prices, especially in places like Vancouver and Toronto, is land value.
Yep.
And so what you're telling me is that some of the policies we're bringing in here, if we're not careful, will end up replicating that surge in land value.
Well, I would argue that Edmonton has been lucky up to now. You have decently good housing prices compared to most cities. If you just start this land value escalation as happened in all the big cities years ago, and you don't add a strategy to secure the affordable piece for the lower, I'll say 40 to 50%, but let's say 40%, and definitely for the lowest 20%, then slowly, and Vancouver is a living proof of this,
Yeah.
you will edit those people out.
Yeah.
That is the history of the maturing of cities. But Edmonton is in the better position than most cities because it hasn't happened yet. And so you can start to allocate development allowances while also identifying obligations to secure affordability. And you work it as a quid pro quo, and it works.
Okay, so that,
I think,
yeah.
sorry,
No,
may I?
Barry, you go ahead.
I'm going to argue that the game has changed. Going back to when infill was first conceived, it was a pretty noble gesture in my mind. I was a big fan of it. In fact, well, I've done a few infill projects. The premise of gentle densification, the idea of making more efficient use of land, it's pretty hard to argue as a planner, urban designer, and architect against that, right?
Agree.
And so the agenda has changed because now all of a sudden with zoning reform, it's all about increasing supply, no matter what. And that changes everything. So the speculators have great impetus to move into neighborhoods and sweep up available properties, tear down perfectly good housing, which is ironic that in order to increase density, you got to start by tearing something down that's still livable. It's crazy to me. But this is an unintended consequence. 15 years after infill began, when it was in its infancy, was actually helping to sort through some issues of revitalization in neighborhoods. Now it's become a major contributor to the housing problem all by itself.
And we're not even talking about quality. We're talking about just the numbers. But
Right.
also you have to constantly be taking care of quality, looking after quality, because ultimately, and I am probably the nation's biggest advocate of density and densification, but I can tell you this, densification without quality control is bad. Densification with quality control is sustainable. It will create sustainable cities. So this idea that, oh, I'm doing really well just to deregulate, just to get more supply and demand is going to happen. But without quality control, which includes affordability, you will see the prices start to escalate because it's going to go to the highest bidder.
100%. 100%. The irony is the mature neighborhoods of Edmonton are the best bones in the city.
Yeah.
You're building new suburbs and new housing on the outskirts of the city with 2x6s that were trees 2 days ago. And the quality is completely gone. That's not design. That's just the material side of things. The problem is the house building industry is so omnipresent in this entire argument that what we're doing is we're bringing suburban housing standards into the mature neighborhoods of the city. And that by definition has an impact on the inherent characteristics of a neighborhood that's well established. The character changes because the streetscapes are being dramatically altered, and everything still looks the same.
So Barry, one of the key agenda goals of the single most powerful infill lobby group in Edmonton is to bring suburban standards, to allow suburban standards and design standards and construction standards in mature neighborhoods, essentially
Yeah.
turning the city into one big suburb, which I
Yep.
think
But you see what's happening. What's happening here is they're taking the attitude of designing for no client. They're designing for the masses. They're designing in a ubiquitous manner rather than trying to do something that's bespoke for a neighborhood. There's a huge difference. If you're working on a piece of land that has nothing built on it, you can drive whatever agenda you wish. But if you want to superimpose those low-level quality standards in a mature neighborhood that may think differently about the suburbs, then you've got a formula for a real problem.
Well,
And
there's
that's a large part of the sociological difficulties we experience in mature neighborhoods.
there's another issue too, and I want to raise it and put it on the table. And that is, a city is not one character area in the whole city.
Correct.
You have to have diversity. You have areas where there are more trees, areas where there are less, areas where there are big houses, areas where there, and it gives maximum choice to a society that has all kind of limitations and benefits and competitive advantages. If you, however, honor neighborhoods and work with neighbors, they'll tell you how in mature neighborhoods to add people, to add housing. I've done this where you go in a neighborhood and they'll say, well, have you ever thought of just, instead of having 2 stories on the major drag there, let's have 4 and then step it back in the back. That'd be perfectly fine. I can tell you 10 examples.
Sure. So Edmonton's every city's unique. Edmonton doesn't have mountains, doesn't have the ocean. Frankly, for a lot of people, it doesn't have a great climate, doesn't have great air connections. It does have a wonderful river valley. But to me, one of the sort of secret superpowers of Edmonton are its neighborhoods, or is its neighborhoods. And I cycle quite a lot. I cycle the length of the city. And just as you were saying, Larry, the diversity of neighborhoods, I'll go through, a traditional 1960s neighborhood like, Strathern or Holyrood. Across the river, there's a heritage neighborhood called Highlands. What's happening in Highlands now? It's subject to this. It's a beautiful neighborhood, and the same kind of the same rules that every other neighborhood are confronting are turning up in Highlands. So you have these heritage houses being knocked down and these 8-plexes being put up, and it'll spoil those neighborhoods.
So housing as a commodity, Larry, or Kevin.
That's right.
Housing as a commodity, just like your smartphone.
Yeah.
So a smartphone in Halifax looks the same as a smartphone in Calgary. And a house in Vancouver, Edmonton, Fort McMurray, Halifax, St. John, New Brunswick, Montreal, in a new subdivision neighborhood, they all look the same. And it's the house building industry that's responsible for that all looking the same. And that's what we're getting parachuted into these mature neighborhoods like Highlands that are losing their characteristics and their integral soul, if you like. I don't want to get too kind of overbearing about it, but the character of a neighborhood is important. Losing that character is what I call atomization. And that is happening at a very rapid rate right now. And it's not a concern for the development community. It's not a concern for our city legislature. They're only interested in increasing supply. That's why communities are upset.
Yeah, it should be a concern.
All they want is some respect.
Yeah, that's right. So listen, we're on neighborhoods. I live in the same neighborhood today that I grew up in. So that's not uncommon in Edmonton. People put down roots and they stay there, but it's a different neighborhood in some ways. In the 1960s, the breadwinner in the house next door to me was an auto mechanic. The breadwinner in the house across the street supported his family by selling Samsonite luggage. Across the alley was a very successful optometrist. It was a wonderful cross-section of society. I still live in that same neighborhood. It's filled now with infill, with low-rise condos, skinny houses, big houses, and so on. But it's almost all white collar. It's gentrified. The diversity, the economic, income, educational diversity is gone. Is that inevitable? Is gentrification inevitable when we're talking about infill intensification? Larry, you were shaking your head right away.
I don't
How do
think
we
it's
avoid that?
inevitable. First thing is, I don't want this conversation to turn into this kind of conversation which says, settle neighborhoods, just forget them, leave them
No.
alone. It's not like that. And that's not what anyone wants to talk about.
That's right.
Every neighborhood is in a process of constant change. Every neighborhood's needs are changing. When a neighborhood sees that it's starting to gentrify, it needs people in the government to work with them to take action to secure so that it doesn't happen. For example, oftentimes it's as easy as protecting existing housing built 40, 50, 60 years ago that's just cheaper. It's just rent cheaper. It's cheaper to buy. You just want to protect them. Maybe you want them instead of it depends on the shape of the neighborhood too. If you have a bunch of large houses built in the 20s, well, yeah, you can turn them into two or three apartments. You can put a house in the back lane. There's many things you can do. You can find a lot. You can find streets that aren't necessary, so you subdivide them and let them put some buildings on it. You can put some buildings on the in where the commercial street is, so your high street's more vibrant, and you add possibilities for seniors and singles. These are all things you can do, but it doesn't happen with a single regulation that applies to every single property in the city. It doesn't happen that way.
Okay, so it doesn't happen, but to my point about gentrification, can you do that in a neighborhood? Can you infill and densify a neighborhood and maintain the income diversities and the employment diversity?
Very simple answer to your question. If you don't take government action to secure affordability, the answer is no.
Okay.
It will go up. If you take government action to secure affordability, you can protect affordability.
Okay.
What is that government action? It's
I think you,
if you want to do a condo, you have to do a rental. If you want to do a high income unit, you have to do a middle income unit. You add the quid pro quos so that the numbers still work in the pro forma, and they will, but you secure that. Otherwise, the market's not going to care.
Barry, you want to get in here? Right.
well, I understand what Larry's saying, and I don't, believe me, I don't disagree with what he's saying because I know it's correct. But the question is there an alternative? Is there a way that we can mitigate the impact of gentrification? Because other than the way in which Larry's describing it be done, where you create another framework whereby you maintain, just like you maintain historic heritage buildings, there's great value in that. So I buy that argument. But I'm also, this is a segue to my book. I also think that it's possible for the private sector to segue into doing what I will call effective urban densification by looking at ways in which the value of land can be removed from the developer pro forma. And that's what my thesis is all about. So backfill is an acronym for back alley advantage, kinship, family, and integrated living. And that's all about a more efficient use of land whereby a landowner who's been around for 25 years in the same house, like you, Larry, partners with a developer, where in partnership they develop new product on their underutilized backyards,
That's right.
against their laneways. They keep their house. They build new products smaller in respect of the new Canadian census, which sees in 25 years the maximum household of one person. And so you take the cost of land out of the equation altogether. What does that do? Well, land cost is almost 50% of the cost of infill right now. So it makes housing instantly more affordable without changing the quality of construction and hopefully creating an environment where You're not changing the character of the street because you're not tearing anything down. And you are better utilizing the back lanes with addresses and sidewalks and mixed use and hair salons and coffee shops, all these things that neighborhoods would love to have, but not necessarily next door on their street, but on the corner in a back lane all day long. I think you could sell that idea. So I mean, that's what my book is all about. So to me, gentle densification with respect is an idea that is much different from laneway housing. I'm not talking about laneway housing, but it's something that promotes good design principles, and it's scalable right across the country. So I'm not just talking about Edmonton. Every city in Canada has this problem. I'm looking at this even from not only a pan-Canadian, but from a North American context. There are ways that the private sector, given a little bit of freedom, and we have that freedom now with stupid new, with our zoning reform, where we actually, this idea slides underneath quite comfortably the allowances within this bylaw, which is all about increasing supply.
That's right.
You take the land cost out, and all of a sudden you can create something quite different.
But Barry, if those rules are so wide, no one's going to be motivated to do the kind of scenario you've talked about, which is one of the most elegant and simple and workable forms of gentle densification.
Right.
But here's one piece that I would emphasize from what you said, because I agree with your model 100%, is the landlord stays. So what does the landlord often do? I've seen this hundreds of times. They put their children in that house, or they put their children in that house first and then later they switch. So you start to get affordability managed by the very community itself.
Mm.
And
I have a whole chapter
you can
written about that.
You can densify
Yes.
4 times current density, sometimes 5 times current density with these kinds of strategies. And there is no profit squeezed out of the neighborhood and taken somewhere else.
That's right.
Profit stays in the community, and it provides a source for affordability.
Oh,
I'm reminded, I'm going to quote a book, not mine. Jane Jacobs. I'm sure most of our audience knows of Jane Jacobs. She famously wrote that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they're created by everybody.
That's
So
right.
what Larry's talking about is not only the notion of a multicultural interaction where people come together to live together, but in a multi-generational change, in a sea change in Canada right now, where because of the housing crisis, people are moving closer to their parents, or parents are moving closer to their children. And so the idea of creating, if you like, a small community of units on a lot that could handle it comfortably, where people can still live independently but be close together. To me, that's a really strong marketing strategy. And we have a demonstration project that's going to show that.
And it's not only a strong marketing strategy, but it also allows you to do that neighborliness that we talked about before.
And it's so vital, yes. Okay,
well, you're both being quite inspiring, and actually we're getting some questions, so I'm just going to switch from me to some of the questions that have come in here. Just as a reminder to people, though, if you're enjoying this and appreciating it, and if you're so inclined, if you go to www.BetterInfill.ca, on the homepage, there is a donate button, and it would really help us out. No bones about that. So here, somebody has apparently said this is a delicious conversation. And then raises the question of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and says the conversation needs to be in concert with these global sustainable development goals. I think there's 17 of them the UN has. Any comments on how infill could be brought in line with with sustainability. And I say this as somebody who lives in a near net zero home. I live in Edmonton in a house that doesn't have a furnace. So you might question my sanity, but actually it works pretty well if you design for that. Very committed to
Right.
sustainability. How does infill relate to that? How can we bring in infill that meets global needs for sustainability?
Well, I'll start by saying, number one, we have to do those. We have to pursue those goals. Infill, by virtue of the fact that you are intensifying, is going in the right direction. Infill that is only done through demolition is not going in the right direction, because you are doing one thing that is the fundamental flaw for sustainable living. You're getting rid of something that's already been paid for, that's already been taken out of the environment, and putting something that takes all new energy, all new carbon, all new resources to put it together. So the more that you can conserve what you have, extend it, expand it, reuse it, cut it up in different ways, the more you can do that. And that's why Barry's model is so important. The more that you are at least not using more resources. Number two, you can start to add more people, which means less demand, or more demands on services you've already built and paid for. Many, many things come in to help you when you're doing any kind of densification. But I go back to this thing, you only can do densification in a free market economy so long as consumers want it. And when you start building horrible places, consumers just go elsewhere. So you
Okay.
need to manage the objectives of sustainability and the equal imperative of livability.
Barry, weigh
The
in.
the idea of neighborhood is the glue that makes all of this possible. The idea of neighborhood is where I find the underpinnings of success in my book. If the ideas have any merit, it's because of the idea of neighborhood. I don't know if our listeners, our audience, has ever heard of the expression NORC, a NORC. A NORC is a naturally occurring retirement community. It happens in neighborhoods where people have lived together or adjacent to one another, or in crescents or in cul-de-sacs for many, many years. And as they age, or if even younger generations are impaired through a car accident, or for one reason or another, their living style changes either temporarily or permanently, then the neighbors pitch in to help out. They get groceries, they help somebody get their clothes shopping taken care of. They look after the grandkids, they babysit, they do all these sorts of things. So you actually have a naturally occurring community just through the friendship and the glue that the neighborhood provides within the context of two or three properties. But the key is that those two or three properties have been there for a long time, as have the social networks that come with the people that live in those properties. So if you build something new without taking down and displacing those very people, you are increasing the capability of adding glue to the neighborhood, as opposed to nuking it and starting all over again. And the saddest thing I see in mature neighborhoods are not only good houses that have been torn down, but excavations that have fences around them and all the mature trees have been removed. And it's like a gravesite. It's like they have to start all over again. It's patently unnecessary in a mature neighborhood. And that's where I think we lose sight of the importance of planners, urban designers, and people in the design professions who are trained holistically to think about these things, and not from a strict, pragmatic, if you like, engineering perspective, where the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The world of neighborhoods, the world of cities, is about much more than that.
Boy, it's almost poetic. I'm probably 40 yards from my house, across the back alley. The Friday and Saturday, the chainsaws were going and the big grinder was going, as every tree on the lot. And these were trees that were probably 60 years old, every tree on the lot. was cut down. And that I'm sure every viewer, at least in Edmonton, has had that experience. And sometimes, anyways,
And that's why though, Kevin, let's just not lament the loss. That's why you have to have management of those trees.
That's
That's
right.
why you have to have a documentation of those trees.
That's right.
That's why in cities that really care about livability and sustainability, they don't just leave trees to be dealt with how anyone might decide on a Tuesday afternoon. They manage that. Yes, you lose trees, you gain trees. Trees die, you add other trees. It's not that it stops development, it just is a decision among development decisions.
okay, so we're getting lots of questions here. Um, there's a theme here, which is not surprising. It's consistent with my opening comments. Um, so I'm going to just read 3 of these, and then maybe Barry will go to you first. How can we convince City Council that there's a better way before it is too late for our mature neighborhoods? That was one question. Then another question, how could a neighborhood be heard? Do petitions work? Larry, you've probably had some petitions your way. And then on the same thing, how can you address the predatory practices of builders? So we'll treat those as one little group here. How do we convince City Council there's a better way? Do petitions work? And how can we address the practices of builders? Barry, do you want to start?
Okay.
Pick one or
First,
all 3.
okay, I'll try and be quick because I could spend a lot of time on this, but I won't. Our profession of architecture and urban design has a responsibility to teach and to encourage respect and performance on a qualitative level. That's our responsibility, to help our municipalities understand the inherent integrity of mature neighborhoods. That's the bottom line, it seems to me. So we need to get an audience, and we need to be given the credibility as a profession for that audience so that we can speak to these principles and somehow embed them into the DNA of our neighborhoods. I don't think it's hard to convince people to do the right thing. I think it's extraordinarily hard to convince our politicians to do the right thing. And I'm not being cynical, but I will start at the municipal level where I think well, Kevin, you've had a lot of experience. Is it fair for me to say that it's probably the hardest job in the world in Canada is to be a municipal politician? And then the second hardest is provincial. And the third hardest, because you're further away from your constituents, is if you're with the feds. I'm not being cynical. I'm asking a question, but I believe it's true.
I think,
and so I think our municipal government has to stop being cheerleaders about all the good things they think that they're doing and have to do a much better job of listening. But I also think our profession has an equal responsibility to get out there and be heard and to try and be as eloquent as we can and not whine and complain all the time. So I'm trying to spend this year to do just that. I have a number of initiatives in my retirement to try and give a sensitivity injection to as many of our leaders in the city as possible, and that's a personal quest that I'm very proud of. Number 2, the Community League network in Edmonton is second to none. We have 160 community leagues in Edmonton. It's over 100 years old. And whenever the city has I'm not trying to single out the city of Edmonton, but it's a fact. Whenever the city of Edmonton needs something at a community level, they go to the community leagues because they are the pulse of all of the neighborhoods. But whenever the city wants to do something like the city plan, the last people they talk to are the community leagues. Why? Because they're pretty sure they're going to get pushback on a lot of neighborhood-driven value sets, and that's where the split in the belief system occurs. Where on one level, holistically, the city wants to do good, but at a granular level, in the trenches, the city is ignoring all of that. So I would empower the community leagues in the city of Edmonton to be on design panels. And I can guarantee you that even though they're not architects or planners or professionals, they just want to make sure that what's ever proposed in their neighborhood is going to be a good fit. That's all. That's all they want. That's all they want. There's no magic here.
Okay, Barry,
So,
or
and
sorry.
what was the third one? And
Well,
sorry,
Well,
Larry.
well,
let's
let
pause
me,
there and just hear what Larry has to say.
yeah,
What was the third one?
I think the fundamental question that is asked in all those questions is a simple one of how do you get your government to pay attention?
Right.
How do you get your government to embrace not just get rid of all the rules and and maximize volume, but instead, how do we have volume and quality? How do you get your government to do that? I only know two ways, and it goes right back to the 60s. It goes right back to Jane Jacobs.
Yeah.
You can plan your neighborhood together with your neighbors anytime you want. And I have found something in politics that has been just miraculous. When you have a movement of anything with enough votes attached, those politicians are going to run to the front to try to lead that movement.
Yeah.
And so it means instead of worrying about always fighting the battle at City Hall, which you're going to lose, you're going to lose, you're going to lose as an individual, instead, convene your community, just exactly what your organization is doing. Convene your community. And I always think it's better to do it at the neighborhood level because that's what everyone can understand. Get them together. Start looking at the existing regulations, make your own plan, decide what you do want and what you would not want, then decide in every single development that's happening, how are you going to position in regard to that? You
Yeah.
start taking control of your neighborhood.
But Larry's
but Larry,
100% correct.
okay, but
This
guys,
is not a one size fits all problem, and it's not a one size fits all solution. Making cities isn't a simple game of construction economics and easy permitting.
but
It goes much deeper than that.
the changes brought into Edmonton, January 1, 2024, specifically are specifically designed to shut out community input. And so,
But you're going to go to the polls.
well,
I don't know when you're going to
I
go to
think
the
that's what
polls.
listeners need to pay attention to.
Yeah, but
Um,
not only that, don't just depend on the polls. Get together with your neighbors and start thinking about something other than a negative message out to the government and out to everyone. Think of a positive message. Ladies and gentlemen, here's how you do infill. Here's how you do intensification. Here's how you respect our concerns. Here's what we would do. Put proposals on the table. Decide where in your neighborhood it fits. Decide how in your neighborhood it fits. Write it all out. Get a few architects who are living in the neighborhood to draw it out for you. It's when you just don't wait.
right, right.
I,
Okay,
it,
so
just Kevin,
go ahead, Barry. Yep.
one last thought, if I may. I can maintain my train of thought. That we have a new zoning bylaw. We have a city plan. We didn't have either of those 2 years ago. Things changed. The nature of change is that's the only constant. So we can do this better. So my view would be that I personally think we should recalibrate infill and what it stands for. That's what this seminar is intended to be about. And let's talk about appropriate revitalization of neighborhoods and their back alleys and mixed use and all of the things that most people would love to have. Would you like to have a little coffee shop in your back alley? And a place where the kids can play road hockey and not have to worry about cars? I think so. I mean, those ideas are not revolutionary, but they help make cities. And I think that if you were able to get people thinking about those sorts of things, you could galvanize interest very easily.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
So one of the questions we have here, they're just coming in fast and furious. And this will relate to both of you, but the question is, Vancouver infills did a great job of architectural design guidelines to new infills. How can citizens ask for some for neighborhood architectural guidelines here? Maybe we've covered that, but Larry, you were probably quite involved in some of those guidelines for infill in Vancouver.
Yep, I
How
was
did
very much involved. If your government is of a mind to have the conversation about what kind of infill fits in your community, and if they have a framework for that, it's a neighborhood planning framework or it's a neighborhood consultation framework, then the question's easy to answer. You get out there and you work with those professionals. If that's not happening, if there's no inclination to do that, you get 10 people together and you start asking the very same questions and you write it out and then you send it to 20 people that those 10 people know, and they answer the question and they say, well, I wouldn't quite do this, but I would try that. And have you never seen this? And then some architect or interior or urban designer will come into the scene and in a very organic way. And this is how we actually started neighborhood planning in the old days before it was happening, when all we had was urban renewal. And very organically, people start to declare what works for their neighborhood. They buy the sustainability principles. They're not back in the dark ages. They buy the livability principles. They buy the respect principles, and they just come together. So I just keep saying this over and over again. Don't wait. Sit down and just write it out for yourself. Ultimately, if enough people agree with you, one of two things happen. Either your local government pays attention or you change the local government.
Yeah,
Do you
that's,
know,
yep.
Larry's 100% right. And we are already well out of the starting blocks. I'll give you a quick analogy. Do you know that the city of Edmonton has more community public gardens than any other city in the country? Not per capita, just in numbers. We have more in the city of Edmonton than any other city in Canada. You know why? Because of the power of persuasion of the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues. We already have a funded infrastructure in place that can promote good design, that can promote good planning, that can promote resilient, livable, and sustainable cities already in front of us. We just need to populate them with a few more folks that are perhaps have a background in different areas where neighborhoods have a particular interest, and we're well on our way to making positive change. So I really am more an optimist, although I sometimes don't sound like it. But I am quite critical of our city, but I love it. That's why I am critical. I want it better, and I think it can be. And I think the catalyst to making it better is the Federation of Community Leagues. And I would love to see their mandate expand.
Okay, so another question here was about in Edmonton right now, there are, I forget the number and I've lost the question, but I thought it was a good one because it'll stir up some debate probably. There are quite a number of surplus school sites that were declared surplus many years ago, and they've sat I think under municipal control, I'm not sure, but they've sat as green spaces. So the neighborhoods have fallen in love with them. They like these green spaces, and in many ways are quite important. The city's now pushing forward, trying to get some at least some housing built in some of these school sites. I can see both sides of this, and it raises very strong views. What are your thoughts on the role of that kind of green space and infill and the conflict that brings? Barry, you're nodding your head. I hope you have more thoughts than I do. All I look at that and I think, oh, that's a tough one.
It's not. This is where the architect comes in. I can take any school in the city of Edmonton that is declared surplus and renovate it. A 30 by 30 classroom is 900 square feet. It's eminently habitable. A school that could be renovated, just the school, to become a housing complex is a no-brainer. And you've got at least 25% the structure of the cost of doing so already in the ground. When it comes to the green space, I would never be an advocate of eliminating all of the green space, but I would be an advocate of protecting it. So I would build around the edges. I would enable housing front doors to front onto the street, and the back doors would front onto a green space, so that you're not eliminating the magic of having green space in a neighborhood. There's nothing better than a small park or a parkette in a neighborhood where you can walk your dog, where you can sit on a bench, where you can enjoy the sun. You don't want to lose that. And surplus school sites give you that opportunity in spades.
What I would
And it
say,
also, sorry, I'll stop there.
well, what I would say is that to me, a school site in a neighborhood that's obsolete is what I would call a neighborhood resource. And the neighborhood should get together, be brought together to say, okay, what do we do with this resource? Some people might say, well, it's all just green. Some people might say, well, don't tear down the building and the rest of it can be green. Some
Right.
people might say in some communities, this is a really good spot for low income and modest income housing or family housing with people with children. So let's do something around that. Every school site will have a different answer according to what the neighborhoods are. And in every one of those situations, what you're doing is pursuing something that actually takes the land value out, going back to our previous conversation.
That's right.
Or better say that the community, through government, is putting its equity into these social goals, these public goals, these community goals that are so important. And so I think every single school site could be diversified. You don't need to get rid of trees. You don't need to get rid of a lot of green space. Sometimes people will say, well, look, you can have some of the green space, but what's left, we would like a better park. We want better
Right.
quality. We want more
Right.
trees. We want more landscape, whatever. That's a neighborhood brokering. And the beauty of it is, it's just it's so perfectly self-designed by a community with the help of some architects, with the help of some landscape architects, to create something which then will be protected by that community against all odds. They'll protect it against, dangerous people coming in. They'll do the whole thing, as long as they were a part of the invention.
Right. So it comes back, very strong theme through here: neighborliness, the strength of neighborhoods, public engagement, respect. Those words come up and those themes come up over and over again. Okay, so we have obviously our audience is hanging in there, and I think it's probably the two of you have drawn an audience that has a disproportionate number of planners and architects and so on. So this is I don't know if it's technical necessarily. It could become that way. Our current planning codes, this is, I'm reading a question here. Our current planning codes, by concentrating on values of volume, height, lot coverage, ratios, and so on, antithetical to placemaking concept of neighborhood. Do
100%.
you want?
100%.
Okay, so you understand that question? Okay, so
I have a little bit more complicated answer to it.
good. Well, let's start with Barry. Barry, you go first.
Okay, I'll be really simple. You can't legislate good design, period. It has to come from within. It has to come with emotion. It has to come with sensitivity, and it has to come with creative people. Number one. Number two, filling in boxes so that a dormer window is, a minimum size does not generate quality in my mind. So to me, that's really, really vital. And Larry may not like this, but I'm a fan of eclectic cities. I'm a fan of eclectic neighborhoods. To me, it's all about the notion of making things a good fit. So maybe I'm saying the same thing as Larry, but in a different way. If something works in a neighborhood but doesn't work in another neighborhood, and if that creates a certain kind of eclectic character in that neighborhood, which gives its identity some focus on a map, I think that's a good thing. So the notion of regulatory frameworks that constipate design creativity, I'm against. The notion of creative frameworks where providing design equivalents and alternatives, even the building code has design equivalent components within it, where if you can show in the building code that something is going to enhance life safety, even though it may not meet the code, it's acceptable. So to me, flexibility becomes very important. And to me, that's the essence of making cities.
So I'm going to just cut you off, Larry, or not cut you off. I'm going to just put you on hold here because Barry, whoops. Barry, what I see happening is when architects, when standards and design standards are relaxed, you don't get a surge of better architecture. You get a surge of buildings put up without any architecture. You get off-the-shelf buildings or buildings that are designed by people who have no interest in the kind of design quality that you have. So
Look,
how do we,
can I-
okay, Barry, or Larry, you jump in.
can I add to this? Look, there's moments of decision-making in a development. The first moment has nothing to do with you, the consumer, anything else. It has to do with a pro forma, a bank, and a developer's inclination. So you need, in my opinion, you do need outside limits to what is found by a community to be suitable in that community. Secondly, in some communities, there's a lot of character, so you need more ideas about what could be included to enhance that character, or what, in fact, would not enhance that character. That's some neighborhoods. Other neighborhoods don't have it. They don't need it. They don't want it. The fact is, the best zoning is usually a kind of zoning that, number one, sets the outer limits. Number two, allows performance to those outer limits as long as you do perform. You don't just do the lowest common denominator of anything. And number three, has guidelines which are trying to tell you what the intentions are without telling you what the design solution is, and they can be written. I've written a lot of them. And number four, has a process where you actually adjudicate that together between the person representing the public interest and the person representing the private interests. So you put it all together, and you then have a system that works. It protects you from the worst abuse by a few people who just don't care. It also allows you to get a lot of flexibility by people who love design. And those two things have to go together.
So Larry and Barry, you've both had your career in this. Is that system you described, Larry, enforced through the work of the development officer from the city who's working with the bylaws and working with the developer and the designer and deciding whether to permit or not? Or like,
I've always felt that the best thing you can do for an architect and a developer is to have a voice that they can depend on at City Hall. So you need people who have been given the responsibility to work with developers to find the right solutions.
so
Yeah,
the current bylaw, zoning bylaw in Edmonton, I think I mentioned this earlier, in many cases actually eliminates any discretion for the development officer.
then you're going to get what you lowest common denominator.
Yeah,
That's the bottom.
that's how it's unfolding here. Yeah.
Yeah, you're just going to get the lowest common denominator. On this, by the same token, if you get too many regulations, too many rules, too many in things that you must do, you're going to eliminate good design, because there's always design invention that creates wonderful things. It's a balance, and the balance has to be different in every single community that you're working, that you're trying to develop in. And particularly, more than anything, when you're doing infill, where there is a sitting context of people and buildings and landscape. You know, when you're doing a big new development over 25 acres, you'll do all those things yourself internally, but not when you have
Right. Right.
existing.
Okay. We're getting towards the end of our time slot. But we do have a few more minutes. I want to make sure viewers are aware, because I've filled a few pages with notes here, and I think, oh, there's so much good stuff here. We are recording this. It will go up on the Better Infill website. That's going to take a little while because there's a process we have to go through. But once we have it posted on our website, we'll send out a group email. If you want to join our group emails, they're growing every week. You can sign up through our website. So as we, yeah, okay, we'll come to that in a minute. So I'm going to broaden this question out. The question is, what are the three top policies in Edmonton that need to change so we can have better infill? I think I'm going to just relax that a little bit and ask each of you to suggest what would be the three top policies a city should pursue or bring in to get the kind of quality infill that you both well, everybody would really want. What would be three things if I were if you were the king or the mayor, what would be the three things you would do to bring in the best possible infill in your city? Larry, you go
Well,
first.
one thing I would do is that I would definitely have all the rules and regulations conceived by experts and neighbors. That's number one. I would make sure that the definition of what's good and what's bad is a collegium between the world's best and the best ideas in that community. That's number one. Number two, I would always err on the side of preserving what exists so that you don't have an unsustainable demolish and rebuild constantly. As much as you can expand and reuse and all that, then the better. Thirdly, I would say instead of having randomness, you want to focus where you would like to have that diversity or that intensification. And then you ask the question of how, and you ask your question of the interface between that and other areas. For example, there's a plan that's just been approved in Vancouver. I'm not going to get into it. High density plan. It wipes out 40% of the low income, middle income, medium income, I would say modest income housing that we already have built and built for 40 years. That's not a good idea. That's the wrong where.
Yeah,
So I would do those things.
I'm aware of that. I have somebody who lives in that neighborhood. I'm sure it's the same plan. And well, and it just illustrates so many things. This is a family who bought a little old house, fixed it up. When this plan went through, there were developers at the door the next day offering them
Well, and
millions
even
of
even
dollars.
and many people just say, I don't want the millions. I love living
Yeah,
in my
that's
community,
exactly
right?
yeah, that's
Their
quite right.
neighbor
That goes
takes
back.
the millions. The
I
neighbor
love
takes the millions, so it demolishes. And so you get to this place, so you say, we have to move out. We have
yeah,
to go because it's gonna surround us. It's gonna take us over.
yeah. Okay, Barry, I've just benighted you the Lord Mayor of whatever city you want to be, and you have three policies to bring in to help develop really good infill. What would they be?
I think number one in Edmonton, but it would apply across the country for me. I would protect the mature tree cover in neighborhoods at all costs, and I would obligate the municipality to do exactly the same. It's one thing to kind of protect it on a private piece of land, and then have the city come along and tear down an elm tree in front of that piece of land. So there needs to be a consistent um, I think, policy with regard to the tree cover, especially in a prairie city where trees are really, really important. Number two, and much more pragmatically, I would reduce maybe by 90% the cost of development permits, inspections, all of the non redeemable costs that don't show up in an actual development. I think there are many examples right around the country where the cost of doing business is really, really high, and it eats into budgets dramatically. I can tell you one project that I worked on, a triplex, where the total costs, soft costs for the project were 11% of the total cost of the project, and that's not consulting fees. That's just superimposed charges, levies, and improvements. That's a significant amount. 11% of a budget, that's a lot on $1 million project. So those are two. Those are
Two.
the two that come to mind.
Okay,
Yeah.
two is good. So I think we should start to wrap up here. I want to really thank our viewers who have stayed in substantial numbers, and remind you again that this will be posted on Better Infill's website at some point. And I also just going to do this one more time, remind you about the GoFundMe page on the homepage, the donate button on the homepage of our website. And I think what I want to do is ask both of our guests, one at a time, of course, just for any closing comments. Larry, do you have any comments you want to wrap up here? Any?
Well, I don't know the Edmonton situation enough, but what I hear is a community that is moving into kind of being at war. Its government, its development community, its citizens over an issue that the government was trying to do a good thing to deregulate. The development community was trying to do a good thing to deliver housing, but the community also wants to do a good thing on livability and quality. In a free society like we have in a free economy, that can't happen unless you do collaborate. You do have to get together. You do have to have a commitment of government to not try to stop talking to people, but to want to embrace people. You have to have a commitment by developers to listen to what they're hearing, but also tell people what they can and can't do in the pro forma of their project. And you have to have community people that on the one hand are clear on what works for their community and also open-minded about what might work with great design. So I think bottom line for a city like Edmonton on this cusp of this moment where you still have the chance to do it right, where your prices are not overwhelming, where your density is not overwhelming, is just all get together and commit yourself to a conversation until you get to a solution that works for all.
Right, wisdom there. Barry, how about you? Closing comments?
Okay, let's go back to this being titled Better Infill. I think we have now a laboratory of built form in the city since the infill question came into play, that we now can take a step back and analyze the impacts of it on our neighborhoods, and remind ourselves that the premise behind infill is not to solve the housing crisis, but to stay in its lane and to do good things in neighborhoods for which infill was originally planned. And in that regard, I would like to think that we could convince those that make decisions in all of this to stop this strident, single-minded way of increasing supply at all costs, and recognize that there is a context behind development that is all about making cities. And infill has a very, very important but small role to play. And I think it's dangerous to not take into consideration the gravity of the decisions that have been made, the unintended consequences that come about from poor infill development at the granular level, socially, economically, and planning wise in a mature neighborhood.
Great comments. We will do our best. We've had somebody urge us to make sure that people in the municipal government see this webinar. So we'll make a point. We did make a point of inviting, I think, all the city councilors and city planning staff. But we will make a point within our absolutely infinitesimal resources to send the link to all those folks. So with that, I'm going to say an enormous thank you to Larry and Barry. It's rare to have so much time and concentration from such accomplished, experienced, and wise people. So thank you very much. We're going to wrap it up now. Goodbye, everybody. And, stay in touch. It's going to be an interesting year in Edmonton. Let's all work towards better infill. Take care. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Larry.